Hi guys, welcome to lecture 4 of our ecology unit. We are going to be looking at big idea 4. So it says biological systems interact and these systems and their interactions possess complex properties. So the first thing that we're going to look at is population dynamics. So there are distribution patterns. There are clumped, uniform, and random. So as you can see, the clumped, basically they are in herds or like school of fish, etc. This example happens to be minnows. Then there is spaced, which is uniform. And this basically, these are individuals that they have territory. So for instance, in this case, it's hawks. And then we have the random pattern. And this is basically just means that they're just going to be anywhere. So an example here would be dandelions. They just kind of pop up wherever they want. So an example question is a biologist studying territoriality in 3 related species of birds found in the same section of a forest. For each observed pair of nesting adults, the biologist measured the distance to the next closest nesting pair of the same species, which is the nearest neighbor, and an analysis of the results is shown in the table. So the question is, which of the following would be most appropriate for identifying the species with the most even distribution of nests? So take a minute and see if you can figure that out. So the answer is actually C. So if you look here, it's standard deviation, which we know is basically, we're going to find the mean, the average, and then we're going to figure it out. So that would give you the appropriate number that you need there. Okay, next we are going to look at survivorship curves. And this basically shows the proportion of individuals that are able to survive at different stages. So there are 3 types. We have type 1, and as you can see, humans are in type 1. This is a high survivorship for the majority of life, and then there's a rapid decline. Type 2 is a constant mortality rate. And then type 3, individuals have a high mortality rate in the offspring, and then lower mortality rate as we get into adulthood, so once they're established. And in this case, we're looking at trees. And then there are life history patterns, which are also referred to as life strategies. And there are 2 types of this. We have R, and then there is also K. So the R-selected organisms, they're going to have lots of offspring that have very little to no parenting. There's going to be a high growth rate, and they're going to reproduce early in life. They also, because of this, end up with shorter lifespans, and they are more suitable for unstable environments. And this kind of curve is the type 3 survivorship curve. Then we have K-selected individuals. And these individuals have very few young and very high parental investment, long lifespans, and populations near the carrying capacity of their environment. And they do need a stable environment. And this is a type 1 survivorship curve. So make sure that you are familiar with those 2. Then we have population growth curves. And this is when the birth rate and death rate are going to have effects on the population growth, obviously. So the growth curves are going to show the change in a population over time. So there are 4 phases. The initial growth, the growth rate is going to be low due to few individuals reproducing. We are going to have a higher birth rate compared to death rate. So that means the population is growing. The second phase is the exponential growth phase. And this is when there is a high growth rate, birth rate is exceeding the death rate, and the resources are plentiful. Now, when we get to the point in phase 3 where we are nearing the carrying capacity of the environment, then you're going to see a change in the graph. And the carrying capacity, which is usually termed as K, this is the maximum number of organisms that can be supported by the environment at that time. So the growth rate is going to drop as the death rate increases due to a lack of food, as well as a lack of space, and it's going to result in an increase in disease as well as predation. And then we have the fourth phase, which is where fluctuation occurs around that carrying capacity line. And if the population exceeds the carrying capacity, we're going to have a higher death rate than birth rate, and the population will decrease. So looking over here at this chart, let's go ahead and label the different phases. So from this beginning point to about hold on one second here. So from right here to about right there, this is your phase 1. And you can see, as it says, growth rate's not very big. Few individuals are reproducing. So from here to about here, this is phase 2. And again, exponential growth, very high growth rate. Birth is exceeding death. So from here to about here, this is phase 3. And you can see this line is actually K. This is our carrying capacity. So when we reach that carrying capacity, that is when we are going to get to this point and the birth rate is going to decrease and death will increase. And then this area over here is your fourth. And that's where it's going to fluctuate between all the other phases. So how are we going to calculate these kind of problems? If you remember, calculating rate is a change in something over a change in another. So we will be looking at a change in population over a change in time. So, for instance, if we look at this graph here, if we say that we want to figure out the change between approximately 4 hours and about 8 or 9 hours, then we're going to be looking here to here. So if we look, it's about a change of 375 organisms. Okay, so basically it would be that 375 over the 4. That would be your equation. This diagram here we're actually not going to worry about. But you should be able to make sure that you understand what each line is saying about the predator and the prey. Okay, let's talk about limiting factors. So populations are going to be limited by these factors, and these factors are basically anything that can affect the population size or the carrying capacity. So we're talking about the amount of food available, the habitats available, whether or not there's natural disasters, the temperature, pollution, the amount of light that they get, the rainfall, etc. So you'll notice that it's mostly we've got listed here is abiotic, but there's also biotic factors as well. So we can say here that they can be classified as biotic, which is living, or abiotic, which is non-living. They can also be classified as density dependent or density independent. So the density dependent limiting factors, these are going to be the effect of the factor is dependent on the population density versus the density independent limiting factor, it's not affected by population density. So if we look here about which one of these would increase versus decrease carrying capacity or population size, abiotic factors, an increase in temperature is going to limit that population size. An increase in rainfall. Natural disasters, an increase in those would decrease the population. A decrease in habitat size would be a limiting factor, could cause a decrease. And an increase in pollution. The biotic factors, increasing carrying capacity, we would have a decrease. Disease would increase the population size. A decrease in competition would also increase that population size. Predation, if we have an increase in predation, that would decrease the population size. And if we have a decrease in food, that would also decrease that population size. So if we look at the density dependent versus density independent, over here, density dependent, all of these are based on the population size. So for instance, if we have an increase in population, we're going to have a decrease in the amount of food available. If we have an increase in the amount of competition, or we're going to have, an increase in the population, we are going to have an increase in the amount of competition. And same thing for disease. It would be an increase in population, increase in disease. As well here, if we have an increase in population, we will have an increase in the amount of predation. The density independent limiting factors will be, for instance, the amount of sun available, the temperatures of the area, the amount of rain, and of course natural disasters. So I want to point out a couple things. First of all, density independent, basically the population does not control how much sun it gets. It does not control what the temperature is. It does not control how much rain. It does not control natural disasters. So that is why it's independence. Also, I want to point out that all the things that I listed here are abiotic, but that does not mean that a density independent limiting factor is not or could not be biotic. So let's look at the two different kinds of growth curves that you need to be familiar with. So we've got exponential growth and we've got logistic growth. So let's take a look here at the exponential. This is also referred to as a J-shaped curve. And this is usually only seen in the human species. And basically, this is going to show, I'm going to add some notes here. This is going to show the biotic potential of a population. This is also our max rate at which a species can survive. This is also going to increase when there are no limiting factors. And I'll give you just a second here to write those down. Next, we have the logistic growth. And basically, you can see here we've got a line showing our carrying capacity. And this is also called an S-shaped growth curve. And it's called logical because this is what is expected. So our next thing is an age structure diagram, which is still related to these growths. So basically, the high number of organisms in the reproductive years lead to rapid population growth. So here, this is actually divided up into areas, and you can see these are age ranges. And these are the number of individuals, and this is what rapid growth looks like. And you can see there are more children between the ages of 0 and 14, and then we've got here the reproductive years 15 to 44, and then it decreases as far as elderly goes. This, for instance, is the United States. We typically don't have as many children as other countries. So you can see that our children is a little bit smaller compared to over here. And then this is the reproductive, and then this is our elderly. And then this one here, you can see it's getting even smaller. And sometimes, in this case, you can look at this. There's not going to be a large amount of growth because the same amount of population here compared to here, they're all pretty similar. So there will not be a huge amount of growth, if any at all. So eventually, when you see a zero growth graph like this, sometimes they will talk to you about another type of graph, which let me draw it here for you. If I can get my computer to work with me. So this is an inverted graph. And basically, that means that there is a decline in the population because right here, the blue, this area is the blue. And then this area is the green. And then this area up here where there's the most is going to be the red. So you can see that there's not any room for growth. There will actually be a decline over time. And eventually, this graph could flip itself back over. Okay, so now we have population equations. And you can see here there is rate and growth on your formula sheets. So, for instance, I want to point out to you really quick that this here, the logistic growth, it has a carrying capacity factor in it. Versus here, the exponential, the Rmax is the maximum per capita in a population. So calculate the population growth rate between 1960 and 2000. So we're going to look right here and 2000. So we have a change in 3 billion. So if we look here at this graph, you can see that these are the amounts of change. So we are going to put 3 billion over a matter of 40 years. And if you put that in your calculator, it's about 75 million per year. And then it says calculate the population growth rate between 2010 and 2013. So we can tell that we've got 3 years, so we know what our time is. And then we need to just look at the difference between 2010 and 2013 over here. So that looks like a difference of 40. So it is 13.3 individuals per year. Okay, so essentially this calculation is more or less your birth minus your death rate is what's happening. So if we look here, there are 350 falcons living in a certain forest at the beginning of 2014. During that year, 50 falcons are born and 30 falcons die. Determine the population growth rate. Well, 50 were born, 30 died, so that leaves us with 20 falcons per year as the population growth. So D, a population has an initial population size of 1,000. Maximum per capita growth rate of this population is 0.6. Calculate the growth rate. So first of all, your 0.6 is your Rmax. So we're going to take that 0.6 times the 1,000. And that's going to be 600 individuals per year. So the biotic potential, or your Rmax, is going to refer to the maximum growth rate that can be achieved at that time by the population. It is the per capita birth rate minus the per capita death rate. So if the growth rate is 0.3 and the death rate is 0.2, then Rmax is going to be 0.1. Growth rate is also dependent on the number of individuals available for reproduction. So for instance here, calculate the growth rate when Rmax is 0.4 and there are 12 individuals. So again, that would be the 0.4 times the 12, and that's 4.8 individuals per year. Versus over here, we've got 0.4 still, but we have now 160 individuals that are able to reproduce. So that takes it up to 64 individuals per year. So this example, I want to show you because some people mess up on this. So complete the following table to show the population growth rate for each generation. So we know that we had 1,000 individuals. Our Rmax was 0.6. So now we're at 600 individuals per year. Now it's important to note that the second generation, you have to add that 600. So we are now at 1,600 times the 0.6, which gives us 960. Which means that we have to add that 960 to the next generation. So it would be 2560. And then you would do the calculations and so on and so forth to keep adding each generation. So a population had a growth rate of 60 individuals per year. What is the maximum growth rate of this population? So in this case, they've given you everything but your Rmax. So we know that we need to find our Rmax. So we're just basically going to set up that equation. Your N, which is your population size, is the 80. So we know that right here we have the 80. And over here we're going to have 60 individuals per year. So we end up doing some math and we get 0.75 as our Rmax. Here we've got 190 gray tree frogs in a swamp. If the R equals negative 0.093 frogs per year, predict the population size the next year. So in this case, we're starting out with a negative number, which is why I threw this one in here. And we're going to do the same math. So that ends up as a negative 17.6. Now keep in mind, you have to use whole numbers. So, because we're talking about population, so we're going to round that up to approximately 18. So if we take that 190 and since it's a negative number, subtract that 18, then our answer would be 172 of the population. Then we have logistic growth. This is when it occurs because of limiting factors and a carrying capacity. So here in a mouse population of 1,000, the maximum per capita growth rate is 0.6. The carrying capacity is 8,000. Calculate the growth rate. So we are going to switch formulas to this one right here. So we are going to have our 0.6, and we are going to have that times our number of our population, which is 1,000. And then we are going to multiply that by the 8,000, which is our carrying capacity, minus our population, divided by our carrying capacity. So if you do the math, which keeping in mind AP exam, you cannot use a scientific calculator, we end up with 525 individuals per year. So complete the table, show the population growth rate each year, assuming the carrying capacity is 8,000. So this one here, this is what we just did, right? So this is our 525. Now we've got to add that to our previous population since it's another generation. So we're going to be at 1,525. And we're going to go through and do the same calculation that we did right here. So pause the video and practice that for just a moment. So if you did everything right, you should have ended up with 741 individuals per year, which makes this new number 2266. This is an example of a population size estimate that was on a previous AP exam, 2013 to be exact. So basically what happened is they wanted to look at a group and look at their population, and they ended up capturing a certain number of individuals, letting them go, and then recapturing them again. So this shows you that they know that there was a population and then how many they recaptured. So we are going to find out the total number of individuals in the population. So we're finding this one right here. So we know that we are trying to find the population. So we started with 180. We do not know how much this is. And our group over here, we know that we started with 14 and we've got 88. So in this case, we're actually going to do some cross multiplication. So 14x is going to equal that 180 times the 88. And then we're going to end up dividing both sides by that 14. So in this case, our x is 1,131. So it's important for you to understand that we're estimating the population size based on this population of original captured individuals, okay? So same thing here. Initially, 30 sharks were caught and tagged. So we have 30. And at a later time, 60 sharks were caught and tagged, and 10 were already marked. So we have 10 here. We have our 60 here. And again, we're going to do that cross math. So we've got 10x, and that's going to equal the 30 times the 60, so we're at 1,800. And then divide that by 10, our x is going to equal 180. So now let's talk about how we as humans have impacted the environment. So human activities can lead to, they don't have to, but they can lead to habitat destruction. And the primary cause of extinction and loss of biodiversity on our planet is from us. So it's important that you keep in mind that organisms cannot move to a new habitat. They cannot switch to new prey, new food, etc. So rapid changes are going to lead to a population decline. Why? Because evolution and development of adaptations, those take thousands, if not millions of years. So some human activities that have had a negative influence. We've got habitat destruction, and that's for housing developments, sometimes just parking lots. And we've also got deforestation. Then there's also the introduction of exotic species, and this can actually lead to an ecosystem collapse. And then, of course, we have polluting the environment, pollution. Let me put polluting. So basically all the trash that you see on the side of the road, the chemicals, the fertilizer runoff, all of that, global warming, it's also going to lead to habitat destruction. So what happens is the habitat destruction can lead to the reduction of our primary producers. And it's also a reduction of energy available to our consumers. So what happens is over time, this gets smaller and smaller and smaller, just like that growth rate that we looked at. And then we end up with that reverse funnel that we just talked about. And this is unstable. This is a stable picture. This is unstable because this amount down here, this is what is available for energy for our consumers. So this type of chart ends up with starvation and death of a lot of the population. Now, eventually, this will right itself, and it will end up looking like this. So there's still a very small amount here of producers available, and it is still unstable, but it can be fixed. So let's talk about the pollution. So the first thing is acid rain. And we learned early on that all organisms are going to have, I did that backwards, sorry, a limited pH range. So basically what happens is that with all of the burning of fossil fuels, etc., then the soil ends up becoming acidic, and then the plants are going to die. And then the freshwater systems become acidic, and then the aquatic plants die, and then organisms die. And then we have global warming. Everyone's heard of that. This is an increase of the greenhouse gases. And basically, because of that increase, it causes more of the heat to be trapped. And then that leads to an increase in global temperatures. And this is actually a chart of reconstructed temperatures over time. And you can see the huge increase that they have predicted compared to previous. Then we have the hole in the ozone layer. And basically, we know that the ozone filters out UV rays. So this ozone can be destroyed by man-made chemicals. So like your CFCs. These things are in like aerosol cans and different solvents, etc. And so basically this increased exposure to the UV, also it leads to higher mutation rates. Then we have eutrophication, which we looked at a little bit. And this is what we talked about, the excess fertilizer running off, adding phosphates and nitrates to the ecosystem leads to an increase in plant growth. It's also called algae blooms. And this can be a natural thing. It's not just because of the runoff, because some ponds, etc., do go through this cycle. But you will see those ponds that are near farmland do it a lot more. So basically, the light is blocked, the plants below are going to die, and then the algae population below is going to die, and then that decomposition and respiration done by the decomposers leads to the depletion of oxygen, resulting in fish and other animals in here dying. Then we have biological magnification. And this is where substances like pesticides, heavy metals, etc. are going to move up the food chain. So, for instance, down here, these chemicals are eaten by organisms, which in turn the fish eats, which in turn the bird eats, which in turn we eat, etc. So that is what biological magnification is. It keeps moving up the food chain. Succession is going to occur after a change in the environment. And there's two types. There's primary and secondary. So the primary is going to begin with no life. There's no soil. There's a new area. So for instance, like a volcanic island. And then the moss and different little plants like that come first. Biomass is very, very low. And then we have secondary succession, which is following the removal of the existing biotic and biomass. The soil is going to already be there. There's an old area. So for instance, a forest fire. And the seeds and roots are already there. Biomass is going to be higher. So the primary succession is establishment of a community in an area that originates with no soil. So there's going to be a pioneer species that colonizes the landscape. So it could be algae, fungus, etc. And eventually, a climax community is established. And that means that the ecosystem has finally reached a steady state. And you can see here, this is the process of that. Then we have secondary, and this is when a series of changes take place after it's been cleared. So the soil is intact. So that's very important to remember. There is soil there. So we've talked about all of these negative things, and we've talked about, what we've done as humans. So let's talk about what we've done in a positive way. So we have lots of things that we can do in order to fix the environment. So for instance, recycle. This is so less resources are harvested and destruction of habitat doesn't occur. We can have habitat preservation. And there are many, many parks in the United States that are like this. And so there's areas of undisturbed ecosystems. And then we can have habitat restoration. So this is an afterthought, but we can still restore it and bring back what there once was. We can education, learn ways to minimize our impact. We can also, politics can limit or ban chemicals. There could be fines or taxes for those companies that do not limit their polluting chemicals. There's actually lots of companies that are getting tax breaks because they have decided to go green. We can also restrict hunting or the sale of certain animal or plant products in order to protect the populations. And then we can also protect our keystone species. And the keystone species, they have a huge effect on the environment. So, for instance, here are some keystone species. You wouldn't think that a slug would have that much of an influence, but it does. So basically, if those keystone species were destroyed or removed, the ecosystem often collapses. And finally, let's talk about the importance of biodiversity. So we talked about how the greater biodiversity means more stable ecosystems, but on top of that, they can continue to supply, and that is important for everyone in the food chain, including us. So for instance, if we destroy plants or oceans, then part of our food chain disappears. There's an agricultural value. So for instance, bees. And bees actually, they have calculated that they pollinate approximately $10 billion worth of food crops annually. And then, of course, we have manufacturing supplies and building materials such as rubber from the rubber tree. There's cotton for our clothing, wool, building materials, etc. And then there's also medicines. And it is estimated that there's approximately 300 or more drugs that have yet to be discovered. So, for instance, this simple little flower has actually started treating leukemia and Hodgkin's lymphoma and has helped these patients go from a 10% survival rate to a 90% survival rate. Fungus, for instance, gave us penicillin. This horseshoe crab, these are actually captured. They're not killed, but they're just captured. And their blood is actually used to keep medical devices free from bacteria. There's actually a chemical in their blood. And then there's, of course, other animals that give medical research. So that is it for our ecology unit, and I will see you in class.